Thank you for joining our high-level event on reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, status, and prospects. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this meeting. I'm Clara Sandoval, Director of Programs at the Global Survivors Fund and Professor at the School of Law and Human Rights Center at the University of Essex. This webinar is organized by the Global Survivors Fund, the UN Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the permanent missions of France, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United Kingdom. It is our belief that effective work on reparations can only be the result of working together. Let me start today with some logistical points. We are live streaming this event through YouTube and providing simultaneous interpretation to English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. You find the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the right side corner, next to the leave button. Please click on it and choose the language you need. To interact during the event, please use the following hashtags: hashtag Act for Reparations and hashtag Survivors Speak UNGA. We welcome your suggestions and views. To this end, we have habilitated the Q&A box where you can post any comments, views, or suggestions. You find it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our webinar today will present the preliminary findings of the global study on reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence conducted by the Global Survivors Fund, its partners, and survivors for the last year. Reparations cannot happen without survivors-centric approach. That is why this event opens today with the video Survivors Speak. I invite you all to listen to survivors. Please, the video.
Since the revival of multi-party politics in 1992, election season has consistently been a time of high alert for Kenyans.
Haki siku hiyo ilikuwa ngumu ya maisha yangu, hata siwezi nikasahau, lakini nikiongea tu hivi nasikia tu yani tuliteseka ndani ya chai hapo. Saa baada ya kukua wanarepu wewe. Mimi tayari ndio hiyo nimegonjeka. TV imenishika. Sasa nikapelekwa usingine na mtoto wangu usingine. Najua mtoto wangu aliaga hata sikuja kumshika juu nilikuwa mgonjwa. Ndio naambiwa tayari uko Steve. Watoto wangu unajua hawakusoma.
Ilikuwa 2007 wakati wa kura. Hasa watu watatu waliingia kwa nyumba na ilikuwa mchana. Mmoja akanishika mguu na mmoja akanidandia. Baada ya muda kidogo nikajikuta niko mjamzito. Nilipoingia kwa ndoa, maisha ilikuwa tu ya kupigwa kila siku, rudisha mtoto kwao. Ilifika wakati nikatamani kama niko kwa ndoa niue huyo mtoto kwa sababu baba hamtaki.
When I was gang raped, I got a child out of that. I was not able to finish school. You cannot give that back to me, right?
Some of us were tortured and we cannot operate normally. We also need psychosocial support. We are still traumatized. We are so discouraged. We are neglected by the entire community. We are facing stigma.
Kama mimi binafsi nililalwa na wanaume watatu, nikabaki na virusi. Mume amekufa kwa sababu alipigwa na huko chini alifinywa. Nimebaki mama na watoto, sina kazi, sina makao.
Watu wakakuja kwa nyumba, wakaanza kuvunja nyumba, wakaanza kunishika, wakaninajisi. Siwezi inama mzuri, kuinua kitu, niko weak. Siwezi control kwenda haja, nikikaa na inakuwa na harufu. Sasa siwezi kaa nje na watu, wananisengenya, wananiongea na mimi sisikii poa kitu kama hivyo nimefanyika. Kwa sababu haikuwa ni kupenda kwangu.
It is the government that failed to protect me on that fateful day of what happened, okay? And the state has got responsibility.
Serikali kama ingesikia malilio yangu, ingesema tu initafutie mahali na inijengee.
Sasa mimi nataka serikali watuone both side, waone side ya wamama na side ya wanaume.
Mimi naomba serikali tumelia hii miaka yote, wakubali watusaidie, warekebishe maisha yetu, nisaidie na mimi nisaidia watoto wangu kesho wakuwe watu, kwa maana wasije kukaa maisha kama yangu.
The voices we just heard echo the voices of many survivors around the world. And with this, I would like just to start with the opening panel today and give the floor to Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is Peace Nobel Prize laureate 2018, but is also the co-founder of the Global Survivors Fund. So I give the floor to Dr. Mukwege. We are not hearing the speech.
Ministre des Affaires étrangères du Corée, M. Ching Chong-mun, pour leur soutien indéfectible dans cette bataille.
Thank you for your effective support in this struggle. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war in many conflict situations throughout the world. In the context... Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak to you at this digital conference on reparations for survivors of sexual conflict and violence, situations and perspectives. I would like to thank the organisers and all the contributors, starting with the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, as well as the French Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jean-Yves Le Drian, Japanese State Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Uto Takashi, and the Second Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, His Excellency Choi Jong-moon, for their support in this struggle. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war in many conflict situations throughout the world. In the context of my work at Panzi Hospital, I have cared for thousands of people who have suffered the unspeakable. What they have endured in terms of physical and mental trauma will have an impact on their life. Their bodies have been torn apart, mutilated, and scarred for life. They will have an impact also on future generations. Such violence against women, men, and children destroys whole communities. The survivors from Kenya, who we have just heard, are a poignant illustration of this. Voices like Rose, Nelly, Shadat, and thousands of others who have had to fight to survive. We are doing everything we can to repair their bodies and ease their pains. But what's also needed to really heal is recognition. Very often, silence prevails. Silence from families, communities, states, and those who are responsible. I even see people turning their backs, turning a blind eye, or worse still, actively rejecting or accusing survivors. Victims have a right to reparations as a solution and a matter of justice. These are part of survivors' need to be recognised themselves and to have the harms they have suffered recognised. They also allow them to rediscover their dignity and feel that they exist again. For example, by exercising a profession, being able to put a roof over their heads, or participating financially in their children's education. Reparations also break the silence. They are proof that survivors are human beings They are worthy of being listened to. And this is why, with Nadia Murad, we launched the Global Survivors Fund. Its mission is to influence states so that reparations become a priority on their agendas. It also provides interim reparations for cases in which the states and responsible parties are unable to actually assume their responsibilities. We are present in many countries, and we are proud today to be able to present our preliminary results from the first global study on reparations. This study brings together experiences from those who have had the courage to speak, to share their suffering and their expectations. It also shows that reparations are within everyone's reach. I therefore count on your support to really ensure that the voices of survivors are heard and can carry outside of our more closed circles of influence. We hope they can be associated with setting up a genuine policy in favour of reparations. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Mukwege. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Pramila Patten, who is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Ms. Patten, you have the floor.
Thank you, Clara. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We meet today with the knowledge that reparations are what survivors of conflict-related sexual violence request most, and yet still receive least. Today's meeting demonstrates a shared commitment to closing the accountability and reparations gap as a central pillar of victim assistance, as well as prevention and deterrence. In this respect, the work spearheaded by Nobel laureates Dr. Denis Mukwege and Ms. Nadia Murad, the work of the Global Survivors Fund, has great potential to improve lives and livelihood, alleviate stigma, and facilitate social reintegration. I am pleased to serve as a member of the Strategic Advisory Committee of the Fund in my capacity as holder of the Security Council mandate on sexual violence in conflict. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly declared that victims of grave violations of international human rights and humanitarian law have the right to a remedy and reparation. This includes victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. In 2019, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2467, which called for a survivor-centered approach to inform all prevention and response measures, including holistic survivor-centered transitional justice, which addresses root causes and provides for transformative reparations. Such reparations are a critical contribution to restoring peace and security in the aftermath of grave crimes. Criminal justice is necessary in the wake of wartime rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, and other atrocities, but it is not sufficient. Survivors often suffer physical and psychological trauma that requires urgent treatment, as well as disrupted educational and employment opportunities. Survivors, as we just heard, face stigma in their families and communities, which compound these harms and prevent many from coming forward to access care. Too often, survivors are twice victimized, once by the crime itself, and again by the system that fails to respond. Too often, the perpetrators walk free, while the survivors walk in shame and fear. As our latest annual report to the Security Council attests, while reparations have been judicially awarded in many cases, they generally remain unpaid, leaving victims empty-handed, even as arms and revenue flow into the hands of the perpetrators and those in power. As wars grind on, they grind down the hopes of entire generations, including children born of rape. My office has been mandated to produce a special report on this subject to address the neglect and knowledge gap that hampers our response, and to ensure specific attention is paid to this voiceless category of victims, who risk being relegated to the shadows of society, marginalized, undocumented, and sometimes left stateless. Children conceived through rape and their mothers face unique and pronounced challenges in societies polarized by war. It is this destruction of the individual and community that makes sexual violence so cheap and effective as a tactic of war and terror, and why reparations are an essential part of reconciliation and peace building. Indeed, of all the transitional justice mechanisms, reparations are the most directly able to make a difference in the lives of those affected. They must be extended to reach traditionally excluded victims, such as children born of rape, men and boys, refugees and IDPs, and others whose very survival may depend on interim relief. Although the crime of sexual violence can never adequately be compensated, transformative reparations elevate the survivor and their family from victims to rights holders. Reparative measures can both provide independence to the individual and help re-establish ties to family and community. Reparations go beyond compensation and rehabilitation to include guarantees of non-repetition, which can help to prevent and deter sexual violence so that succeeding generations may be spared this scourge. Indeed, my mandate is developing a prevention framework that aims to make guarantees of non-repetition a reality through legislative, security sector, and other institutional reforms. Further research is needed, including actionable recommendations from survivors themselves, to co-create solutions with those directly affected who know best what they need. And in this respect, the global reparation study being launched by the Global Survivors Fund today gives us an at-a-glance snapshot of the status of reparations in countries of critical concern as a basis for advocacy, cross-country learning, and the replication of good practice. As the United Nations, we stand ready to support member states in implementing reparatory measures, technical assistance, while at the same time continuing to advocate with governments and duty bearers to meet their responsibilities. We report regularly on progress and gaps in this regard to the Security Council and relevant sanctions committees. My mandate, including the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, and the interagency network, which I chair, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, comprised of 20 UN entities, have provided technical, programmatic, and financial resources to reparation programming in the field. We will continue to work side by side and shoulder to shoulder with all those who seek to provide reparations and relief to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Tragically, however, threats, attacks, reprisals, and restrictions on victims, witnesses, healthcare workers, and civil society organizations continue to impede these vital life-saving efforts. As one survivor from Myanmar reported to my office, I have not received justice or any reparation. On the contrary, I have been threatened with death for telling the truth. I therefore urge the international community to ensure that protection and assistance for victims of sexual violence and those supporting them on the front lines are part of their political engagements, humanitarian interventions, and programmatic assistance in the wake of war. I thank the member states that have already made important contributions to this fund and programs on sexual violence and conflict more broadly, and look forward to hearing from them today. Together, we must find ways to accelerate action and help survivors realize their right to effective reparations and redress. This is the only way to ensure that transitional justice is truly transformative justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Patton. Your office has been a long advocate for reparations for victims of conflict-related sexual violence, and under your leadership, we've seen decisive action in this area. For that, we thank you. And we also thank you for reminding us that prevention, deterrence, reparation, and survivor-centric approaches are crucial and that we must work in relation to all of them. Now, I would like to invite everyone to listen to the speech that Ms. Jeanne-Yves Le Drian, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs from France, is going to give us today.
Mesdames et messieurs, aujourd'hui encore, les situations de conflit donnent lieu.
Ladies and gentlemen, today conflict situations continue to give rise to sexual violence, undermining the most fundamental human rights, and especially those of women and girls. Too often, rape is used as a weapon of war, which is truly revolting and completely contrary to international humanitarian law. The international community must take resolute action to tackle this unacceptable state of affairs by condemning those atrocities unequivocally, by tirelessly fighting against the impunity of those who perpetrate them, and by providing survivors with the care, support, and assistance that they need. France leads these combats for law, justice, and humanity and will continue to lead them. Alongside its international partners, Madam Special Representative of the Secretary General, and alongside all civil society actors that share our commitment. I'm thinking especially of you, dear Nadia Murad, dear Dr. Mukwege, and of the Global Fund for Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. Since the fund was launched in 2019 at the G7 under the French presidency, you have carried out remarkable work, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, and Guinea. You were the ones who broke the silence on a topic that was ignored for far too long. You provided the victims with quality treatment that put them on the road to recovery of both mind and body. And you walked alongside them every step of the way towards rebuilding their lives. I would also like to commend the action of the Fund in documenting this violence through the various studies that will be presented today. It is essential work. We are therefore very proud to be supporting this invaluable commitment in the field and to victims through the €6 million contribution we made to the Fund. The fight against sexual violence during conflict is also a priority for France at the Security Council. It is one of the challenges of our commitment to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. More generally, the fight against all forms of gender-based violence is central to the feminist diplomacy that I endorse on behalf of France. That is the meaning of our mobilization in an extremely worrying political context in support of the universalization of the Istanbul Convention. This was one of the key projects for the Generation Equality Forum that we hosted in June with Mexico and under the aegis of UN Women. More than $40 billion was mobilized on that occasion to define in detail the gender equality imperative. That is one of the main purposes of our support fund for feminist organizations with a budget of €120 million over 3 years. The determination of Nadia Murad and Dr. Mukwege and the extent of what they have already established are a reminder to us all of our responsibilities. We must take a united stand against sexual violence, which intensifies the horror of armed conflict, and against the violations of the rights of women and girls, which have become all too commonplace, by becoming completely uncompromising on respect for human rights, because this is what is at stake, and by equipping ourselves collectively with the resources to take action to make a real difference. You can count on France, and I hope that we can count on you too. Thank you.
And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Uto Takashi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
ご出席の皆様、日本国外務副大臣の宇都隆です。本日は紛争関連の性的暴力生存者のためのグローバル基金が主催するイベントにおいて、共催国として日本政府を代表し、メッセージを寄せることができ、光栄に思います。紛争下における性的暴力は、今日の国際社会においても撲滅されていない重大な犯罪であります。紛争下で性的暴力の被害に遭った犠牲者や生存者の方々は、暴力によって名誉と尊厳が深く傷つけられます。それは生存者の方々の経済的な自立も妨げてきました。日本は紛争下の性的暴力によって傷ついた生存者の方々の自立を支援するというこの基金の趣旨に強く賛同し、その活動を設立当初より支持、 支援してきました。まずは、基金の設立の立役者であるムクーゲ医師と村戸女史に敬意を表したいと思います。そうした観点から、日本は基金に対し、これまでに計400万ユーロを拠出し、理事国としてその運営に積極的に関与しています。また、紛争下の性的暴力担当国連事務総長特別代表事務所が有する紛争下の性的暴力関連のプロジェクトにも資金を拠出し、加害者を処罰する仕組みづくりに貢献しています。心身ともに大きな傷を負い、今まさに苦しんでいる方々に寄り添い、支援することが何より大事です。紛争下での性的暴力をなくすため、今後も関係する皆様と連携しつつ、様々な支援を続けていく所存です。2020年の年初以降の新型コロナの感染拡大により、弱い立場にある女性や女児が大きな影響を受けています。国連の報告によると、紛争下の性的暴力の生存者はコロナ禍で一層深刻な状況となっているとされています。紛争下の性的暴力により傷ついた方々が自立の手段を得て自信を取り戻し、経済的、社会的に活躍することができれば、私たちの社会に新しい視点がもたらされ、新型コロナからのより良い回復のためのきっかけを生み出すことができると信じています。そうした意味でも、コロナ禍によって支援の手を緩めることがあってはなりませんし、紛争下の性的暴力をはじめとするジェンダーに基づく暴力が容認されてはなりません。こうした認識が今、国際社会で共有されていることは大変心強いことです。引き続き、国際社会と連携をし、暴力の撲滅と生存者の救済、支援に向けて取り組んでいきたいと思います。本日のイベントでは、基金のこれまでの活動が報告されると聞いております。このイベントを通じて、多くの人々が紛争下の性的暴力の生存者たちの自立に向けた支援の重要性を認識するきっかけとなり、実り大きいものとなることを記念しております。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
And now I would like to give the floor to Herr Choi Young-moon, who is the second Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Nobel Peace Prize laureates Dr. Denis Mukwege and Ms. Nadia Murad, special representatives of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, Excellencies, distinguished guests. It is my honor and pleasure to be here at this meaningful event on reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. This is an issue so close to the hearts of the people in my country. From its inception back in 2019, the Global Survivors Fund, or GSF, has made a significant contribution towards identifying and providing assistance to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV. The success of the fund's activities has been twofold, that is, strong network with partners around the globe and a survivor-centered approach in dealing with the CRSV issues. The Republic of Korea has been a strong advocate of the survivor-centered approach, launching the Action with Women and Peace initiative in 2018. And I'm glad to inform that the third International Conference on Action with Women and Peace will be held in Seoul on November 25th this year in hybrid format. Distinguished guests, as previous speakers have underlined, reparation has a significant meaning for CRSV survivors. Reparation is not and should not be merely a measure of providing financial support or other services. It is a process of recognizing the survivors as rights holders and of restoring their honor and dignity. In this vein, I'd like to underscore that the spirit of reparation can only be fully realized when complemented by other elements of transitional justice, including truth, justice, and guarantees of non-recurrence by memory. And here, I should reiterate that the survivors must be at the center throughout all this process. Exactly 30 years ago, the late Madame Kim Hak-sun came forth and testified to the public for the first time her pain and agony as a so-called comfort woman during World War II. Without her and other survivors' testimonies that followed, the tragic stories of this comfort woman would not have been revealed to the world. With an enduring sense of gratitude and appreciation for their courage, the international community should turn these painful experiences into valuable lessons from history. This is the only way to remember those courageous survivors and restore their dignity so that their pain and agony may never be repeated. I would like to pay respect to the GSF and its partners that are working hard for this noble cause. And with a deep appreciation toward their endeavor, the Republic of Korea will also continue to heed the voices of the CRSV survivors and further bolster its efforts and role in the international community in combating the scourge of CRSV. I hope our exchange of views will sow seeds for our future work. Thank you.
With this, we finish our closing panel, our opening panel, but I just would like to say that this opening panel reminds us that reparation is a condition to individual, family, and community healing, and a measure of justice. It reminds also of the obligation of individual states, as well as the international community, to take resolute action to provide reparations to survivors, as they need to become independent and be recognized as right holders in order to be able to restore their perceived honor and dignity. And now I would like to give the floor to Danae van der Straten, who will chair our second panel. Danae, down to you.
Thank you, Clara. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danae van der Straten-Ponto, Head of Advocacy and Policy at the Global Survivors Fund, and as such, lead on the Global Reparations Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this second panel. So the objective of the panel today is twofold. First, we will reflect on the status and prospects for reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, based on the preliminary findings of the first ever comprehensive study assessing global reparation opportunities worldwide. Then we will have a closer look at the situation of Nepal and Kenya. And we have 5 speakers, and I'm kindly reminding all speakers to strictly stick to the time they were allocated, because we have a really, really packed agenda. So with this, our first speaker is Esther Dingemans, Executive Director of the Global Survivors Fund, who will present in exclusivity with you today the initial findings of our global reparations study in 16 countries. Esther, over to you.
Thank you very much, Danae. And I would like to start offering my gratitude to all the speakers at the event, and also to the organizations and the survivor networks who were involved in conducting the global reparation study. There were over 30 organizations and networks involved. I would also really like to take the opportunity to thank the donors who supported the study through their contribution to the Global Survivors Fund. And that is the countries co-hosting the event, as well as Belgium and the European Union and Norway. What I would like to show you here on this map, if we could move to the map, please. Fantastic. So these are the 16 countries that we initially conducted our study in across 5 continents. And we looked here at conflicts in the past, in the more recent past, and also in the present. Additional work is currently ongoing in 12 countries, and then we hope in the future to look at more situations. Important to mention is that we really try to use a very participatory method in doing our study, and as much as possible ensure that the process itself had reparative value for survivors by providing intensive psychological support, capacity building, and really involving survivors from the start to the end. And with that, I think we were able to really have very deep discussions with survivors about their needs and their views with regards to reparations. Now, just before turning to the recommendation, let me share with you one observation, and that's across the globe, that is in the countries covered by our study. Only a tiny minority minority of survivors actually have access to reparations. So there's a massive, massive implementation gap, which is shown here on this slide. So these are the 16 countries that we conducted our study in. And then you will see these countries in yellow here, that these countries have some sort of reparations policy in place or in progress, which in principle should theoretically open the door for reparation programs. Like that, there is momentum at the moment in Mali, South Sudan, you see, in Gambia, and also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that's in principle positive, but it's not enough, because what is also needed is strong legal frameworks and institutions to actually make sure that reparations that are then also given to survivors. And then what you see is that it is only Iraq, Colombia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina that have such frameworks in place. And then the question, did these frameworks then also lead to reparations being given to survivors? And unfortunately, the answer is no, or hardly. The mechanism in Iraq is yet to be developed, and in Colombia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, only a small percentage of the victims have actually received reparations. So in short, there's no consistent effort by states to deliver reparations, but what is really important is that there is momentum. So now let's move to 5 recommendations on making reparations a reality. So what does the study tell us? And I would also like to refer to our website, where there's much more detailed recommendations for all the countries covered by our study. But the first one, and that I think resonates with some of the words of the previous speakers, and that's the urgency. Reparations should really not be an add-on at the end. It should be a priority, and actually as soon as possible after the violation. So survivors in our study are waiting since 10, 20, sometimes even 40 years, and time is running out for them. So that's the case in Cambodia, Bangladesh, Colombia, Chad. Survivors are literally dying without receiving reparations. Now, with that, the study also challenges the idea that we need to wait for the conflict to fully end, or for transitional justice mechanisms or frameworks to be fully in place. Survivors in several countries have made that quite clear, that though reparations really need to be connected with other transitional justice measures, they should not depend on that, because then time is taking too long. Even actually during the humanitarian phase, in some contexts, lots can be done, and also by the states, to recognize harm and to compensate survivors, help them pick up their lives. And that is distinctly different from humanitarian assistance. Last on this one is that where states are really not willing or able to provide reparations, that is there where we really see non-governmental organizations can come in and provide what we refer to as interim reparative measures. But there's more about that in the third panel. So the second recommendation is around comprehensiveness. It was mentioned before, survivors request acknowledgement, and that is what we saw in the study. Interesting, I think, acknowledgement for their status as survivors of sexual violence specifically, but also as victims of war more generally, and interestingly or importantly, also acknowledgement as a person, because the violence that they have experienced is really perceived as dehumanizing. It's really reduced them to objects, to property of others even. And reparations are, in their view, a way to counter this. Then acknowledgement can, of course, take the form of an apology, which is very important, but also commemoration events, memorials, and art-based remembrance. It should not only come from state, and that is what survivors clearly say, also from their communities. Then, in addition to acknowledgement, to build their lives or rebuild their lives, survivors across the globe demand monetary compensation, but in combination with livelihood support. We see that in many of the countries where we conducted the study. And I do think it's important to emphasize that it is not a life of luxury that they're asking for. It is really simply to send their children to school, to be able to take care of themselves and live in dignity. What you see, I think, is that survivors are already blamed and shamed for what has happened to them. But then on top of that, in almost no matter what country, I'd say, we see that survivors have lost their income, and they really struggle to survive. And that in itself further exacerbates the hostility against them. So material investments are needed, and they really help to break that cycle of exclusion. Now, when it comes to comprehensiveness, it was already said, really important to keep in mind that many groups are easily overlooked, also for reparations, LGBTI, men, and children. And we consistently found that survivors feel that children born of war should always be included in reparation programs. The third recommendation is about domestic reparation programs. So there's actually two avenues for reparations, simply said. Either awarded through courts after a successful trial, or through domestic, or what's also referred to as administrative reparation programs. Now, in the latter, there's no need to identify the perpetrator, and that's for the majority of victims is actually not possible to identify the perpetrator, so it's important. Also, the procedures are less heavy and the evidentiary threshold is lower, so these programs can be accessible for much larger numbers of victims, potentially. Important, it's not to say that reparations ordered by court are not valuable. On the contrary, they're really valuable, but only accessible by very few. And our study confirmed that they're ever hardly enforced. That also, I think, resonates with SRG Patton's words earlier. And this causes disillusion and really unnecessary suffering. And an example of such unmet expectations is the case of the victims of the Hinsenahabe case in Chad. The African Union Trust Fund, that the establishment of which was actually judicially ordered in order to give the compensation to survivors, has not yet been operationalized, and the urgency is certainly there. The fourth recommendation is about co-creation. We also heard it before. So a reparation program without a serious engagement with survivors risks not being reparative or can even do harm. So we need to really co-design these projects with survivors, and that's also in state-led reparations programs. So according to survivors, I find it interesting what we heard is that the mere fact of working with survivors can send a message in the community. We are human, we're equal, and we're taken seriously. So the process itself is important. Now, for survivors to meaningfully participate, investments in survivor networks are really needed. That's a key finding of the study. And what we also see is that these networks often appear to be the driving force to get reparations on the agenda in the first place. So we see that in Colombia and Cambodia, Central African Republic and Iraq, and also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's encouraging, and we hope to see that also in more countries to come. The last recommendation then is about civil society. It wouldn't surprise you that survivors don't always see the state as the sole possible provider of reparations. On the contrary, in many victims' lives, the state has been completely absent or even responsible for the violence and is mistrusted. So reparation programs, they really need to be developed, but also implemented and monitored with the involvement of those who have survivors' trust, and that's often NGOs. So adopting a community-based bottom-up approach is needed, and decentralized approach is also very valid in some countries, while of course ensuring consistency. And I think Mali is a good example of that, where we saw that although victims of conflict-related sexual violence are officially belong to one of the categories of persons entitled to reparations, hardly any sexual violence survivor actually came forward to share their testimony with the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, and that is required to be registered as a victim and then receive reparations in the future. So it really shows how important the role of civil society can be potentially in the identification process, bridging that gap between survivors and the state. So in conclusion, reparations are a right, they're urgent, a priority for survivors. There's a massive implementation gap, but there's also momentum and opportunity. We also firmly believe reparations are feasible, especially if we adopt community-based approaches and if we work together. And it's very clear that there is a role for everyone, for the states, for the international community, for civil society organizations, and most of all for survivors. So then to end, we're looking at one more aspect, and that is the costing of reparations. And I just want to give you the heads up there that reparations are also affordable, but that will be a topic for next year's event. Thank you very much. Over to you, Danae.
Thank you, Esther. So you highlighted the crucial role of a survivors network, and that's really something that struck me as an essential piece of the reparation ecosystem across many, many countries. And now we will hear from other actors of that system with our next speaker, Dr. Suzanne Rizal, Chief Executive Officer of Nagrik Awas, which means Citizens' Voices in Nepali. Nagarik Awas is a leading peace-building organization and GSF partner in Nepal, together with the International Center for Transitional Justice. Dr. Rizal will reflect on some of the challenges and opportunities in Nepal. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Danaya. I'll start with the two quotes from the women who faced conflict-related sexual violence during the armed conflict in Nepal. We need the answer to why our human rights were violated, though they know everything, but want to make it silent by asking us for evidence and witness. These are two quotes, and the situation of women in Nepal. The armed conflict ended in Nepal after the signature of Comprehensive Peace Accord in November 2006. Many women experienced conflict-related sexual violence during armed conflict, but there is no data. Despite the peace agreement, the terrible condition of women who were affected, who suffered from the sexual violence, have not been changed. This despite the many opportunities offered by the peace agreement. Key factors that enable the armed conflict, such as discriminations, poverty, and exclusion, still remain unaddressed. Another major flaw of the peace process is the lack of understanding of gender justice. Women who faced sexual violence were excluded at the entry point of the state-sponsored relief services and have not been considered as conflict-affected victims. This has contributed to the further marginalizations of these women who continue to suffer from innumerable harms. Due to the regressive and narrow mindset of patriarchy in Nepali society, women who face sexual violence have not been able to participate as equal citizens. They have been deprived from their sense of identity, as well as to receive the dividend of peace. Besides this, the unwillingness of the government and the major political parties to expedite the transitional justice process and reparation, and the hesitancy to amend the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions Act has also been a major barrier in mainstreaming gender justice. More recently, the government has prioritized COVID-19, local elections, and Constituent Assembly over the victims' rights, still failing to address the structural violence of the armed conflict and gross human rights violations. It is necessary to address the immediate and long-term need of the women who face sexual violence to allow them to live a dignified life. Some recommendations. Number one, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Act needs to urgently be amended to bring it in line with applicable international human rights standards and with the directives of Supreme Court made in 2015. Number two, ensure access to justice and remedy for women who suffered sexual violence. Number three, end discriminations using diverse measures, including interim relief for women who face sexual violence and ensure their right to reparations. Number four, fulfill the commitment of Comprehensive Peace Accord of Section 7 and Section 3, which guarantee investigation for the human rights violation cases, punishing perpetrators, ending impunity, and providing effective remedies to the victims, including reparation and challenging the structural violence. Provide support for the immediate and long-term needs of the women who face sexual violence in terms of their medical treatment, physical and psychological, sustenance of their income, education support for the children, as well as for their social establishment, by reducing the stigma attached to sexual violence among the women by creating safe spaces. Ensure there will be no denialism in the official memory. Future generation needs to learn what happened to the woman of sexual violence to say never again to violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. What you said shows that it is really unacceptable to exclude victims of sexual violence from any reparation or interim relief program. So what do we do about that? So let's turn to our next speaker for this, Professor Ganesh Bhatta, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Nepal, which has the mandate to recommend reparation measures for those recognized as victims of the conflict. Professor Bhatta, the floor is yours. Professor Bhatta, we can't hear you. No, we can't hear you. We still can't hear you. If you could check your mic. Sorry for the technical issue.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Distinguished panelists and participant, greeting and namaste from Kathmandu. At the outset, I would like to thank organizer for taking such a great initiative to hold this important event virtually, and also for this opportunity. I am sure event like this will certainly be helpful to understand critical challenges that survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and other are facing. Further, allow me to provide brief background of the context that I am going to share in this August gathering. With the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2006, Nepal entered into a new political discourse. Earlier, the conflict between Nepal Communist Party, Maoist, and which lasted for 10 years have had multiple impact in Nepali society. A large number of people have been displaced, disappeared, and there certainly has been gross violation of the human right from both the side, Nepali state and the Maoist. In order to address various grievances of the conflict victim, the government of Nepal also constituted Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 2015, whose main objective, among others, are as follows: find out the truth, assess situation of the victim and perpetrators of conflict, recommend reparation to the conflict victim or his/her family, recommend legal action against the conflict perpetrators. With regards to the issues related to sexual violence, which is the topic of my talk, the Commission has received 7 types of grievances. The Commission is investigating them on case-by-case basis and would recommend legal action against those who committed crime and would recommend reparation for the victim. As of now, 63,718 cases have been registered with the Commission. There are sizable number of cases related with sexual violence as well. Although there are no separate act to deal with cases related to sexual violence, particularly during the conflict era, but the Commission has come up with clear guidelines and act which would look into these cases and provide reparation accordingly. The reparation, however, will only be provided after full investigation is carried out. The Commission then recommend compensation and would be provided either directly to the victim or his/her family member as stipulated in the TRC Act. There are 6 types of benefits proposed for the victim of conflict violence. 1, free health and education. 2, vocational training. 3, provide loan either without interest or on concession. 4, residential arrangement. 5, provide employment. And 6, any other benefit that Commission deems necessary. All these provisions will be implemented as per the wishes, demand, and the need of the victim. The Commission has deeply realized the trauma that victims of sexual violence have had to go, though yet they are getting less benefit from the state. From the state. For that reason, it has introduced the provision of providing benefit, which Commission can recommend on its own discretion and the need of the victim. I also would like to bring it to your kind notice that Commission is working tirelessly with concerned government authorities and a civil society member to expand spheres of benefit so that all the victims, including the sexual violence, are compensated and integrated in society with dignity. I also would like to state that the Commission is also expanding its organizational structure to speed up the process, and the government of Nepal is firmly committed to this. Once again, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm pleased to hear about Nepal's commitment, and we are looking forward to seeing real practical progress, and we are ready to support Nepal in its efforts.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we will now look at the situation of Kenya, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Jacqueline Mutere, founder and director of Grace Agenda, one of the two partners of the Global Reparations Study in Kenya, together with CSO Network. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Danae. Good morning. My name is Jacqueline Mutere. I'm a survivor of sexual violence of the 2007-2008 post-election violence in Kenya. And I'm also the proud mother of a child from that conflict. I'm honored to be here today, not as a single individual, but to represent and amplify the voice of women, men, girls, and boys, survivors of sexual violence, whom I share a common daily journey. I share with you all present here today the impact of a most traumatic violation that remains present in our memory and lives every single day. My scars, though invisible, have a very visible effect. As a survivor, my sole motive has been campaigning for recognition and reparations. And here I am, 13 years later, still seeking acknowledgement, recognition, and reparations. As survivors, it has been our fragile resilience, our commitment and resolve to justice, our refusal for the violation to be our identity that gives us courage to continue holding our heads high while struggling to retain our dignity as we continue the fight for reparations. Over 3,000 survivors of sexual violence in Kenya are still waiting to benefit from the 10 billion Justice Restoration Fund. The absence of an implementation plan for the policy further harms us and increases our fear, our anger, and our frustration and pain. Meanwhile, we must regularly deal with the impact of sexual violation, that is the children conceived, the psychological lapses, the suicidal thoughts, the feelings of being unworthy, the daily loneliness, the HIV infection and its very expensive treatment, the physical and other disabilities, the lack of support for livelihoods, the healthcare for ourselves and our children, a home, a family, a belonging. Kenya has the responsibility to acknowledge survivors and create an environment of support for their healing through reparations. We are not mere statistics, but citizens and rights holders. Many of us live in shame, ostracized by our families, communities, and because of a lack of recognition, even ostracized by our country. And so I stand before you here today, as a survivor, on behalf of so many others, giving voice to our concern, and with the following plea, that we know and believe that reparations are affordable and achievable. And to realize reparations for sexual violence, states must, as a matter of urgency, number one, stop making reparations about cost, but more about the dignity of the survivors, respect for life and a new beginning. Dedicate a budget line to repair survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Number three, utilize a survivor-centered approach in implementing reparations programs. And number four, cut out the bureaucratic procedures that so often discourage survivors from coming forward and instead create a private and respectful healing space that promotes dignity, removes trauma, and eliminates stigma. And Kenya in particular should also, 1, appoint a special secretary for reparations to design a reparation program for survivors of sexual violence. And number 2, organize a meeting of survivors with the head of state, His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta, where we can discuss the reparations agenda together in a survivor-centered approach. I strongly believe, and on behalf of all survivors, I dare say, that the part that wants to heal is much stronger than the part that is broken. All survivors are asking for is to live like others do. As a Kenyan, I think that cannot be asking for too much. I thank you for listening to us. And above all, I want to thank the Global Survivors Fund for giving us an opportunity to participate in this Global Survivors research. Thank you.
Thank you for your powerful words, Jackie. Your journey and your work are a living testimony of the survivors' strength and courage and demonstrate the importance of Survivors Network as a building block to put the reparation agenda forward. And now with this, I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Mary Weragu, Chief State Counsel of the Office of the Attorney General and Department of Justice, and Chief Executive Officer of the Victims Protection Board in Kenya. Mrs. Weragu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danai. Thank you, everyone. Kenya has been applauded as one of the pioneer countries in Africa that have sought to redress the past through transitional justice. This has included several steps. One of the main ones is that TJRC, what we call the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. The TJRC was established and made inquiries into sexual violence and made specific recommendations on a reparative framework that would cater for conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, in its report. Such reparations, which were recognized in the TJRC report, would include financial compensation, medical and rehabilitation, public apology, commemoration, amongst others. Subsequently, and it is, I think, well known and acknowledged here, and the previous speaker has just said, the Kenyan president established the Reparation for Historical Injustices Fund and allocated Kenya shillings 10 billion to it. The purpose of the fund is to provide reparations to victims of past human rights, including survivors of sexual violence. Furthermore, on 25th March 2015, the president in his State of the Nation address made a public apology, which was a recognition for all past human rights violations. The Office of the Attorney General, of which I work, drafted the Public Finance Management Reparation for Historical Injustices Funds regulations to enable us to provide a framework to operationalize the reparations payment program. But unfortunately, the regulations have not yet been adopted. We later saw the need of creating a policy to clarify directives on the administration of the reparations fund. Given that the survivors in Kenya are of various types, there needs to be a clear framework, and the Office of the Attorney General, as a lead, plus other multi-sector agencies, have developed a draft reparations policy, which needs to be finalized, calling for support in terms of multi-sectoral technical expertise. That is the challenge. The challenge we have is in the area of the policy framework, and that is just one area where we have been asking that perhaps we can get technical expertise, but the draft policy is ongoing. It has been said that we need to recognize, and we do, that reparations through an intersectional lens so as to address the underlying root causes and structures. In addition to all that, in 2012, a multi-agency task force was established under the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, or DPP, to look into all offenses that occurred after the post-elections violence of 2008. The findings resulted in prosecutions of perpetrators of rape and other offenses. It has also encouraged, that report has also encouraged other survivors to come forward to claim their rights. Also, a court decision has recognized that survivors of sexual violence ought to be paid, and 4 survivors in one case have already been decided in December of last year that they ought to be paid. And subsequent to that, other survivors have brought cases against the Office of the Attorney General, against the state, and this has now is an issue that we have accepted must be addressed in terms of looking at payments towards survivors. There has also been established a Victim Compensation Act in which we are looking at now regulations for a trust fund for victims of offenses. In conclusion, monitoring, analysis, and reporting of conflict-related sexual violence should be prioritized and strengthened. Victims of sexual offenses should be accorded efficient and prompt access to justice. We propose a paradigm shift on how reparation frameworks are designed. We ought to come up with innovative efforts to combat CRSV, strengthen victim empowerment and participation in designing reparation policies. Kenya is one country that has come together with civil society organizations to have dialogue and to look at these issues of CRSV so that we can have a joint resolution and so that we can have a survivor consultative method. This will be achieved by having sustained engagements between governments, donors, the international community, regional bodies, CSOs, NGOs, women leaders, and women organizations. I thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mrs. Waragu. There seemed to be great momentum to continue dialogue with the civil society and other actors in Kenya, and we would be very happy to provide the technical expertise or any form of assistance to help Kenya take the agenda forward. Thank you. So we will now have a 3 minutes break. It was initially planned for 5 minutes, but we slightly behind schedule. So I'll ask you to stay with us and rejoin in 3 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Hello, everyone. We are ready to start now our third panel, which is a panel discussion on national reparation programs and survivor-centric approaches. On this panel, we will be looking at two key opportunities for reparations that have been mentioned so far. They are domestic reparation programs and interim reparation measures. Domestic reparation programs are a key enabler of reparations for survivors, even if the results so far remain much to be desired. On this panel, we will dialogue about the Colombian experience, one that Esther was mentioning as one of the three that, as part of the countries in our study, have produced some results. Not the expected ones, but some results. We will talk about its achievements, the shortcomings, but we will also look at interim reparations while looking at truly survivor-centric approaches, how they look like, how we craft, deliver, and impact these types of reparations can have on victims. And we will consider two case studies there. One is Guinea, and the other is the Democratic Republic of Congo. I will start today with Clemencia Carabalí Rodallega, who is the director of the Association of Afro-Descendant Women of Northern Cauca, Colombia, one of the organizations that has been partnering with the fund to conduct the study in Colombia. Clemencia, bienvenida. Clemencia, quiero preguntar.
Welcome. I'd like to ask you, Clemencia, what is for you the importance of repair programs for sexual violence victims in transitional processes, especially in transitional processes such as Colombia's, where there is also a peace process in progress? Clemencia, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Blessings to you all. We want to thank the fund for the opportunity to participate in this space. We are part of organizations that have been working for more than 20 years in Colombia for women victims of sexual rights. We have the right to repair and to reconciliation and the guarantee of non-repetition, as well as the right to peace. In Colombia and in the Northern Cauca region, for more than 50 years, we have had an armed conflict that is not yet over, that has mainly affected Afro-Colombians and indigenous peoples. We have seen armed groups coming to our territories. They have militarized our lives and transformed our ancestral and cultural relations and imposed their violence, including sexual violence. Sexual violence is not understood in our ethnic communities. This cannot be understood as something individual. This affects relationships in our cultural and economic practices. These are the axes for continuity of our collective life. Black women are the articulators of organizational community programs. Generation after generation, that has been our role, and we have learned and taught the care for life and for our lands. For instance, in my case, my mother taught me to wash gold for traditional mining in the river, and she learned it from her mother. These are learnings that go beyond economic issues. For example, when we have our farming activities, we bring our children with you, and it's 5 or 6 women working on a plot of land. Then we move to the next plot of land, and that is our exercise. This is a learning in the community with other women, among women. This is a learning that helps us remain organized and stick together because we need one another. Sexual violence isolates us. It goes against our organizational processes. We feel that it isolates us. We cannot be alone. Sexual violence affects the role that we play as women in care for life and for our territories. For us, repair is a fundamental right, and it has to be comprehensive. There has to be and economic indemnity, but also rehabilitation measures and the guarantee for non-repetition, taking into account the collective dimension that is so important to us. In ethnic communities, you cannot think of individual repair. In Colombia, we have a victims unit that is responsible for other tasks, including the implementation of collective action plans. Despite having more than 100 victims of sexual violence, as documented in the report that we have recently presented to the Commission for Truth, our recognition has not yet been possible by this unit for us to access collective repair for victims and the organization. We know that this is not the only case in our country. We believe that proper repair has to contribute to repairing the damage of sexual violence, but has to be transforming, allowing us to restore our lives collectively in territories where we can take care of life, where we can have hope and freedom. Our fight to be repaired remains in the middle of the war. We need a real effective implementation of peace agreements signed between FARC and the government in 2016. We believe in repairs as fundamental tools for reconciliation, for the construction of peace, to finish with violence and reduce the inequality gap. We will continue to fight for our repair actions that will rebuild our bodies, our land, actions that will rebuild lives, because none of us is as strong as all of us together. Thank you very much. Thank you, Clemencia. You're also an example for the cause of repair, to manage to achieve repairs. And that is a fundamental topic that you mentioned, collective repair. When we talk about sexual violence, it's not individual damage only. You have just explained the community damage that has to be repaired, and it forces us to think about it. Now I'd like to ask Paula Gaviria. I will give the floor to Paula. Paula will talk about her experience providing repairs in Colombia through the program created by the Victims Law. She had the opportunity to lead this program for many years. Paula is currently the COMPAS director, but she is also a member of the high-level panel established by the UN Secretary General on internal displacement. Paula, with your broad knowledge, would you please tell us what are the lessons learned? What do you consider we should learn from the Colombian case?
Thank you, Clara, and hello to everyone. In this short time, I would have to say 3 lessons learned from the Colombian case. One, to recognize in order to confront silence and impunity. So granting a public character to what has historically been considered private and recognizing sexual violence as a violation of human rights and an acceptable crime that has been a systematic practice in Colombia. 33,715 victims of sexual crimes are recognized in the official registry, but these numbers could be as 30 times higher. Survivors can register the case for another 10 years, including ex-combatants, victims of reproductive violence. The burden of the proof relies absolutely on the state, but we need to reach all the victims. Recognizing that sexual violence denies human dignity and prevents the basic exercise of citizenship contributes to a sense of life and the vindication of the victim's dignity, as well as community social fabric, as Clemencia said. Recognizing its widespread practice that occurs in highly patriarchal contexts is the starting point for a transformative effect of reparations. More than 80% of survivors do not report to authorities. Impunity rate in Colombia is 98%. So many victims of sexual violence harbor feelings of fear, frustration, and insecurity. Second, participation to confront shame and stigma. More than 6,000 victims participated in the designing of the law, and almost 900 municipalities have participatory mechanisms working nowadays, some led by women survivors of sexual violence. More than 700 collective reparation processes many of these led also by women. A survivor asks how to heal the wounds of the soul when society makes the wounds stronger. So in order to fight the culture of silence and stigma, the state declared the 25th of May, the day journalist Jeanette Bedoya was kidnapped and raped, as the National Day for Dignity of Women Victims of Sexual Violence, to recognize the courage and resistance of thousands of victims of sexual violence, claim their dignity, and reject this crime. The state cannot do it alone because of the deep mistrust and inability to reach the survivors. Networks of support can better reach victims and help them access prompt and adequate health services, also healing and rehabilitation processes. And third, transformative reparations to regain autonomy and move forward. 8,400 people have been compensated for an individual amount not exceeding $3,500 US. For victims, reparation for sexual violence goes much beyond an economic incentive. The state has to work with survivors to search for the best possible transformative effect for reparations. The process here is as important as the result. Survivors need to feel they are treated with respect and through their rehabilitation process, regain their self-confidence. The gender approach and sensitivity implies that public servants have adequate training to avoid re-victimization. Reparation must take into account intergenerational impact of sexual violence and must focus on the transformation of current realities of the victims. An accompanying process for the use of the resources of compensation contributes to the strengthening of their life projects and their capacity for agency. The transformative approach implies that reparations are comprehensive from a gender-sensitive approach, so they should interrelate with the explanation of the violations as the Truth Commission is doing. Society must know the dimension of what happened to the victims of sexual violence. The silence imposed has to break, as well as the pacts of non-recognition between the warriors. And finally, 3 members of the former FARC Secretariat were asked to recognize the responsibility by command for sexual crimes before the Peace Tribunal. This is a fundamental step for the overcoming of justification of the crimes committed and the recognition of the profound damage that was caused.
Thank you so much, Paula, for saying so much in such little time. You make us think about the importance of recognition, about participation, victim-centered approaches, but also about transformative reparations and how we can go about it. Now I would like to turn to a different situation, and it's the situation in Syria, where we don't see really anything happening to provide reparations to victims. And here I would like to introduce you to Diab Serrilla, who is the co-founder of the Association of Detainees and the Missing of Sednaya Prison. Diab, I would like to ask you, what do victims of conflict-related sexual violence in Syria want and need as reparation? What can we do in Syria today?
Thank you very much for inviting me here in this event. And regarding and as for being the co-founder of the association, and that has more than 3,000 persons have been tortured and detained and other violations here. This association I'm coordinating is an association of detainees and missing of Sednaya prison to support the survivors and finding the evidences that happened in this prison and also in other detained centers, and also to involve the survivors directly in any dialogue or resolution regarding their issues. This kind of association work is here to involve the survivors, not to exclude them. And to also here we say we have to speak on our own. This is their need, and there is a willingness to support and to participate here and engage to find solutions and suggestions during the discussions and other topics related to their lives and rights in Syria. Survivors and victims we must to discuss our needs and rights regarding the justice and transformational justice, and we have experienced it during this period. And to return, we here focus more on their needs and finding the equality of justice and recognition of their rights by providing the work and cooperation with the fund GSF. We here try to reply to answer their needs and define and meet their needs also. And also find the accountability or comprehensive accountability for those perpetrators, and to make sure nothing will be repeated. And also there is their needs for those victims and survivors by providing psychology service. And also we here to rebuild their lives here and the survivors. Also, we have consulted many of the survivors. They said that they didn't speak before and didn't have been heard before. And here we are here to involve them, to engage them in the study, to know their needs and to know their experience, and also support them literally. So here is the importance of reparations for survivors, and finding the solutions for them, and even for them and their relatives and families. And here we need to support them and find their needs by finding the illegal detention for them, and also to find the evidences that they are illegal, they are innocent for these crimes. And here also to affirm again in this compact that the victims and survivors and their families, they represent themselves, none they will represent them. And this will come with a real justice for they all, and must consider their needs and requirements as an essential. And also we need to find their needs and requirements at all. And this is the recommendations from the association.
Thank you so much, Diab. Thank you so much, Diab, for those words, and again for placing the emphasis on the need to create networks of support on participation as key to really trigger reparations. That's key to keep in mind in relation to the Syrian case. And now I would like to move to interim reparations, and I would like to invite you to listen to what Fatoumata has to say to us through this testimonial that was made by the Global Survivors Fund and other of our partners that clearly shows us the impact that these measures have had so far in her life.
Donc mun tan bi na so ri kun kinan ku bi nkirin na hayala walkena hina yinaki in te na samini ba ma ina fa in te ne serfi mina direct wala comprendre mun walike serfi mina su place inte moy lo gine yere sa mun walike yere serfi yere Fatimata Kamara, ma Kamara. Ayaka saramone ma. Akhara ta akhara. Asga amati. Hala tuna 20 ayaka saramone ma. Mutana na dogbo mala. Mutana febri ne ba ma. Mutana so mutana minima mutana association kirin. Na wonyen to do ki mu fa na ye ki alko ira mu so gefe ku. Unna do ki ba ta métier ku alko unna toro. Na 28 ma. Muna kikena oyo muna mwa ko musto bila gbesa ma kesne zo dugina na mu be na ba to mu ma timone mu ko bi to nsaka ne mu yo gbe mu na bulima Oscar musta ska staduma mu bia men na kam mu bombo kat mu bia wana ba fina ba mu ne mo han faga magame ina bi fa yati nkirine 4 ans ato men na stade fima après gi madina kata anan mu man kala.
Bon, après le 28 septembre, on avait fait, enfin, je n'ai pas pu soutenir ma femme. On a fait une petite divorce là. Mais les enfants ont parlé. Je suis revenu. L'amour d'elle jusqu'à présent. On dirait que c'est aujourd'hui qu'on s'est vu, quoi. Je la soutiens partout. Tout ce que je cherche, c'est pour elle et pour les enfants.
With apologies for the problem with the subtitles, I will kindly ask the technicians to please play the video again so that everyone can hear Fatoumata.
Donc un temps bi na so yu kunki nan kui bi nkirin na hayala walkena hina yinaki in te na samini ba ma ina fa in te ne selfie na direct voilà comprendre mun waliki selfie na sur place inte moy lo gine yesa ngol ki yere selfie yera. Fatimata kamara ma kamara ayaka saramone ma akhara ta akhara asga amati hala tuna tonjina ayaka saramone ma mutana na dogbolu mala mutana febri ne ba ma mutana so mutana minima mutana association kiring na wonyen to do ki mu fa na yi ki alko ira mura so gere fe ku on do ki ba ta métier ko alko on toro na tonjuma muna kikena oyo muna mwa ko musto bila gbesa ma kesne zo dugina na muine mu be na ba to mu ga matima ne mu ko bi to nsaka ne mu be mu na buluma oska musto ska stade ma mu be men na kam mu bombo kat mu ga bra wana ba fina ba mu ne mo han faga mu ga me ina bi fa yati nkirine 4 ans ato men na stade fima après gi madina kata anan mu man kala.
Bon, après le 28 septembre, on avait fait, enfin, je n'ai pas pu soutenir ma femme. On a fait une petite divorce là. Mais les enfants ont parlé. Je suis revenu. L'amour d'elle jusqu'à présent. On dirait que c'est aujourd'hui qu'on s'est vu, quoi. Je la soutiens partout. Tout ce que je cherche, c'est pour elle et pour les enfants.
It was definitely worth listening to it again. Fatoumata had a lot to say to us. And now I would like to ask some questions about interim reparations, like how do we get there, how victims participate, how is it possible to co-create reparations, etc. to two speakers on interim reparations. The first one is Saran Cissé from the Association of Victims, Relatives, and Friends of September 28, tomorrow, AVIPA. Saran, would you please tell us about your experience co-creating interim reparation measures in Guinea? What do you consider to be key lessons from this process that you would like to share with all of us today? Saran, you have the floor.
Okay, bonjour.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mrs. Saran Cissé. I'm from the Association for Victims, Parents and Friends of the 28th of September. We've been working on the issue of reparations, and I was lucky enough to be able to participate in sessions with survivors talking about this issue. We really felt that we were able to share our experiences, share our ideas, trust each other, and really look to find victims who didn't have the courage to speak out, try and give them a voice, try to recognize them. We really encouraged them to come and speak to us, and they received these interim reparations. This also allowed us to follow training programs. We've really acquired many different skills and knowledge that's really enabled us to work on this issue within our country. So this has been enabled us to really forge relationships between us, and we're going to really remain united in solidarity with other survivors here in Guinea. We have been able to receive therapy through our reparations, recognition also of how we have suffered. There have been many women who really hadn't been able to get up and properly function after being raped. They were separated from their children as well, sometimes separated from their families, their husbands, and they really didn't have the ways and means to actually care for their children. Now, thanks to reparations, we've been able to actually resolve this issue. We've been able to really get families back together. This has also enabled us to have collective reparations and actually work on the issue of housing for survivors. So we're working with all survivors in Guinea, and we hope that this will enable us to really carry out our own activities, so our own work, our enterprises, like the dyeing enterprises that we saw, the fabric dyeing, etc., and to really look at our own stories and share them and try to actually spread knowledge about this issue, because we feel that it's important to really look at institutions and look at responsibility as an issue. We wish to really create spaces, safe spaces for all those who have suffered, and to support these survivors and really enable those who have been unable to actually participate so far to actually continue this work and to understand what happened on the 28th of September. This will help us also to meet other survivors from around the world who could perhaps come and share with us what we're doing, to see our work, to see what we're actually setting up for survivors. So this is not only for survivors of the 28th of September, but other survivors of sexual violence in my country. This issue of reparations has also enabled us to look at what happened in the past, the issue of impunity, the issue of what people are becoming today as well. So if we have become victims, we have to also look at why and try to really address people's understanding of what happened, try and change mentalities around this. So, we have people who are women with families, and there are still questions being asked around why perhaps some people are becoming spokespeople for other survivors. We really need to raise awareness. We need to make sure that everybody can really play their part to identify perpetrators and to really try to bring them to justice and to share our testimonials of what happened. And so all this is thanks to the reparations that have been given. We've been able to access care as well. It's important to look at health as a key issue. Health was really lacking among survivors, but thanks to reparations, we've now been able to improve this access to healthcare. Now, what we really are asking for is justice.
Thank you so much, Saran. We really appreciate
Muchas
your
gracias,
words.
Saran.
Listening to you reminds us how these communities of practice, communities of support are possible and what you can actually deliver. But it also reminds us about something essential about interim reparations, and is that they are not a form of humanitarian assistance. They are different and they have reach. They are not only about compensation, they also get to deal with health. They also come up with collective reparations with your help from the victims. So this is really remarkable. Thank you so much for your words and for sharing with us your experience. Now I would like to turn to the experience in DRC and ask Tese, you are the project coordinator of the Global Survivors Fund and the Pansy Foundation in the implementation of the interim reparations in the North and South Kibbutz and Kasai. So I would welcome your reflections on how it has worked, what are the key lessons learned there. Tese, you have the floor.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Clara. En fait, le projet GSF.
Thank you very much, Clara. So our project, GSF and Pansy Foundation, covers the two Kivus, North and South, and Kasai, Central Kasai. And we have 30 villages that we've identified. The project has 3 specific targets areas. Firstly, this is to promote the central role of victims in this issue and sharing this approach. Secondly, an individualized approach. And thirdly, measures that are really transformative. I'm going to maybe go into more detail on each of these 3 points. Firstly, the idea of having victims as a central part of this. The idea is to really create programs for and with survivors. So we look at implementation criteria, our working methodology for working on the ground, and how we can really best guide our practices. We've had a lot of consultations at each stage of the project to make sure that survivors who really know what they need the most can identify these needs, identify the expectations, because they are the best place to do this. So what are the approaches to put in place to facilitate the reparations process? So we have psychosocial support measures as well to facilitate this process. I said before that the project also had a specificity linked to the local and localized mechanism approach. So first of all, the idea is that many survivors are also social workers within the project. This allows us to actually have an approach that's really adapted to the needs of each individual and each locality. The idea is that we really try to facilitate the implementation in this way. We have a steering community that is really functional. So the idea is to really have survivors and people from civil society and UN agencies, etc., experts who really know the reality on the ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and to really propose solutions that are completely adapted to the local context. So this determines some of the coherences between our project and some of the international standards in quite a complex context. I also said that we are implementing measures that are adapted and also transformative. So one of the first identified challenges was linked to how to discuss this issue of reparations with survivors, because some of them who have even gone through legal processes have lost their way slightly in the process. They've been misunderstood or badly understood, and they want to understand what's really happened to them and how they can access this process. Sometimes the humanitarian aid that they've received has really not been enough. So we're trying to actually look at this issue and how we can really encourage people to get back into work, have their own entrepreneurial activities, also have healthcare support and explain reparations in terms that they understand. So how do we actually explain reparations to survivors? So when they understand the concept well, they can access reparations more easily and really express their needs. We're also looking at mobile clinic mechanisms to facilitate this support. So bringing doctors and medical staff to the ground, to villages, to the localities, so that these individuals can really access medical and psychological support. We're also looking at collective measures that are the fruit of the consultations that we had with survivors and other members of the community. And this is the idea when it comes to actually rolling out our projects and trying to respond to the different challenges we're faced with on a day-to-day basis. This is how our work is actually carried out. We're often seeing how these victims are continually coming up against traumatic situations, having to sort of relive what's happened in the past. And this is a challenge for our teams. Our teams are often having to listen to a really traumatic accounts, and we have to also support them, of course. So we have to really take into account the needs linked to the context, and this is what we're doing. Thank you. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you so much, Tese. I think you are mentioning many important points, but I want to pick up on one that we cannot forget, and is the contextualized approach, the need to always think reparations in context and responding to the particularities of the victims, their surroundings, and the networks, and so on, that is there, including what is being provided, for example, as interim assistance or humanitarian assistance and the like. Now, with these views, I would like to conclude this panel. Challenges have been noted, but also plenty of lessons that we need to learn and that show opportunities. Those like interim reparations or domestic reparation programs need to be seized in order to ensure that victims can satisfy the right to reparation. Survivor-centric approaches in the design, implementation, monitoring of reparations are key to ensuring that victims can really fulfill the right. And reparations appear to be more effective when truly created in co-creation with victims. And with this, I give the floor to Danae van der Straten to chair the closing panel. Thank you.
Danae, you're muted still.
Sorry. Thank you for
Disculpen. Gracias por esta discusión tan enriquecedora. Basándome en los panelistas para esa sesión de cierre, vemos las acciones para todos nosotros y lo que se recomienda trabajando juntos, que podamos asegurar que la reparación
become a reality, and we each can and must play our part. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Nadia Murad, Nobel Peace Prize laureate 2018 and co-founder of the Global Survivors Fund.
Seven years ago, ISIS committed genocide against the Yazidi community of Iraq, using one of the oldest tactics of warfare, sexual violence. While wars are no longer fought with swords, rape is still widely and systematically used to rip communities apart. Sexual violence violates not only the victims, but also our universal values. An important part of ending conflict-related sexual violence is showing that we value the human rights and dignity of survivors. Eliminating sexual violence will take sustained multilateral cooperation to change the systems of gender inequality and warfare. In the meantime, reparations can be enacted today. Victims are not to blame for sexual violence. Yet they are too often left to piece their lives back together, all on their own. Who is responsible? The perpetrators? Well, of course they are. But also the governments and international communities that felt the mandate to protect the basic human rights of all people. Reparations are a moral responsibility for these actors to make amends. At the same time, reparations are also a vital pathway for survivors' recovery. To survivors, reparations are not an abstract principle of justice or a topic for legal debate. Reparations are the difference between going hungry and having enough food to put on the table, between sustaining lifelong injuries and accessing productive healthcare, between being outcast from their communities and being able to put a roof over their heads. To be clear, reparations are not charity. They are a mechanism to address repercussions of sexual violence that ripple throughout every aspect of a survivor's life. Many consequences of rape are invisible, such as stigma, shame, and trauma. But reparations provide a tangible acknowledgement of the harm endured. Reparations cannot buy back all that survivors have lost, but they can help survivors build a new life for themselves and access the rights to which all people are entitled. Yazidis have been waiting for 7 years to restart their lives, but survivors have received shamefully little support. The Yazidi Female Survivors Law was passed by the Iraqi government earlier this year with the intention of providing a framework of reparations for survivors of sexual violence. Survivors are still waiting for the law to be implemented. Yazidi survivors cannot wait another 7 years for support. Their survival and well-being depend on acknowledgement and amends for what they suffered. The authorities owe them at least that much. To the leaders gathered here today, I thank you for your partnership in the work to end conflict-related sexual violence and for speaking out to condemn the crime where you see it. Today, I ask you to match your moral outrage with a clear commitment to supporting reparations for survivors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadia. Your role and that of other survivors activists securing the adoption of the Yazidi Survivors Law shows the milestone that can be achieved when we all come together. And for those interested, there will be another high-level event this coming Thursday from 10 to 12 New York time on this law and ensuring effective reparation programs in Iraq. And now we will listen to Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, UK Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth, and Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict.
Good morning. May I firstly say to you, Dr. Mukwege, and to you, Nadia, your commitment to survivors and your determination to create positive futures is absolutely inspiring for all of us. It is, as ever, a great honor to work alongside you as we all fight for justice. After the horrors endured in countries from Colombia to Iraq, from Bangladesh to Bosnia and Herzegovina, I know that for many survivors of sexual violence in conflict, justice and reparations and support are fundamental but important and crucial steps towards rebuilding their lives. I'm therefore so grateful to the Global Survivors Fund for continuing to walk that road, side by side with those who have suffered and indeed continue to suffer. For nearly a decade now, the United Kingdom has been actively committed to preventing and responding to the scourge of sexual violence in conflict. Indeed, we remain the only country throughout the world with a special representative, an envoy dedicated to this work, together with a policy team devoted to this huge issue. Of course, we cannot change the story on our own. Funding and collaborating with partners like the Global Survivors Fund drives the action we need to see. We, the United Kingdom, have supported the fund since its inception, and this year we are proud to be here for the first time as a board member of the fund. We have heard today about the global status of reparations and the need for survivor-centered initiatives. But each of us, each and every one of us, must play our part. I therefore call upon all member states to take meaningful steps to establish comprehensive and lasting reparations programs that grow from and actively address the needs of survivors, putting survivors first. As we've already heard from SRSG Patton, who again has been an incredible advocate for many years on this important issue, such initiatives should be part of any transitional justice efforts that we make. And I'm sure we all agree, without exception, that survivors must be at the heart, at the center of these programs. And they, as we've done in the UK, help us to create policy. They're co-creators. They help us to develop policy and programs. But on their own, even best initiatives are not enough. Therefore, I urge governments to implement the necessary laws to allow them to deliver reparations, or indeed remove all legal barriers. These things, I accept, take some time, and we are mindful that those who have endured conflict-related sexual violence need urgent short-term assistance. While support programs are being established, I urge governments to provide quality mental and physical health services for these incredible survivors. Working with trusted delivery partners on the ground, we need to be reaching survivors, reaching them right now. I would like to end with a few words on the issue of impunity. Despite the gravity of this crime, we still see, sadly and tragically, a consistent lack of investigations, lack of prosecutions, and ultimately the punishment of perpetrators. The United Kingdom continues to strengthen pathways to justice. We are already working closely with Trial International, the UN team of experts, and other partners in the field to provide legal support to survivors and indeed to strengthen institutional capability. In collaboration with Nadia Murad, which has been an incredible partnership, we are working to develop the Murad Code. This global code of conduct ensures that the investigation and documentation of sexual violence crimes upholds survivors' rights and does no further harm. And under the United Kingdom's G7 presidency, we have collectively, as the G7, led for a call for an end to conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray. We have already deployed a team of experts to Ethiopia, scoping mission to understand what the challenges are. But that's the first step, to play our part, to see what we can do to strengthen justice and ultimately assure accountability for survivors. Let me also share with you that we are convening G7 partners to consider how to bolster the international architecture around meeting the challenges of preventing sexual violence in conflict. There is so much work still to do, and therefore I end by calling upon all of us collectively, us, the global community, to work together to address this grave failure of justice and to put survivors at the heart of our approach.
Thank you, Lord Ahmad. For the last 10 years, the UK has been a true champion for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So now I'd like to simply inform you that we will run 10 minutes late, but please bear with us because we have our last very distinguished speaker. And it's my great honor to give the floor to Mr. Pablo de Greiff, former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence, and board member of the Global Survivors Fund.
Thank you very much, Dane. Because we are late, I will be briefer than I originally intended, but I want to express first that it is a deep honor for me to be part of the board of GSF, to, of course, recognize the absolutely astonishing work of Ms. Murad and Dr. Mukwege, and the survivors that preceded me in today's session. I want to make, given the shortness of time, just two basic points. First, to deflate what is usually used merely as an excuse, namely that reparations cannot be afforded. This is a point that is made both by national governments and by the international community, and in both cases without justification. When I was meeting with ministers of finance in my capacity as special rapporteur, and I asked to see the calculations that allowed different countries to establish that they could not afford reparations. They were never able to show me any because, of course, none of them had even taken the trouble to run through basic back-of-the-envelope calculations about the costs of reparations. At the level of the international community, something similarly surprising takes place. Despite all the rhetoric about the interrelationships between human rights, security, and development, the truth is that security and development displays more justice and human rights related considerations in a totally short-sighted way. So in a 2010 study, about 46 countries that had programs for the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of ex-combatants. Of those 46 countries, only 8 had even considered a reparations program for victims, and none of them had completed those programs. So I want to say, if we are serious about the interrelationship between human rights, security, and development, as we should, because of course they are in fact interrelated, the victims and survivors today gave a very compelling testimony about the interrelationship between reparations and, for example, economic activity, the ability to parent, the avoidance of the intergenerational effects and reproduction of the consequence of violence. There is absolutely no question that human rights and development are related, but similarly, they are related to security. It is, of course, easier for receiving communities to accept returning ex-combatants when they do not feel that the only way to get the attention of the state is to bear arms and to exercise violence. The second point that I would like to make in the minute that I have left is that, in fact, it's not just that reparations are affordable, but that they are effective, and that they are effective on the condition that we remember that the political economy of reparations is one in which networks and alliances play a very important role. The displacement of public resources doesn't take place spontaneously. It takes place because of the capacity of civil society to exercise some pressure. That takes some degree of organization, and organization also takes some degree of support for aspects of reparations that have been usually underattended, including psychosocial support, support for networking and for contact between different groups. In other words, dimensions of reparations that have a lot to do with the well-being of both the individual and the community, and that cannot be reduced to an economic factor as important as economics are. So in a nutshell, reparations are affordable, and reparations can be effective on the condition that you take seriously the participation of victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. And thank you for stressing that reparations are feasible, affordable, and effective. And that will be really the focus of a lot of our work in the coming year. So with this, we come to the end of our event, and you can find more information on the Global Reparation Study, a summary report of preliminary findings, and also detailed country briefings on our website at www.globalsurvivorsfund.org. And our full reports will be coming out in the next few months, including, as we said, on the costing of reparation, because as highlighted by Pablo, that brief, reparations are affordable, so watch the space. I take this opportunity to extend my huge appreciation for the hard work of the Global Reparation Study team, for our partners, and above all, I want to thank the strong and courageous survivors who have contributed to this work. Your resilience is humbling. And as Jackie said, the part that wants to heal is stronger than the parts that's broken. Thank you all for joining.